became very patriotic. And in fact, the two of you became very patriotic during this war, and you referred to the troops as our troops.
Ah!
Now why?
We?
Were you not a war correspondent? You weren't actually one of the troops,
you
were
make
you?
patriotic sound like a sin.
Well, you tell me.
No, I mean, you know, this business of non-bias and impartiality.
Exactly.
And for a long time, I think we both kept to the British troops, and the British Sea Harriers today did this, and, you know, we kept to the British bit and the Argentine bit. But I must admit that it was difficult sometimes to keep your own feelings in control. It was very difficult at the time of Sir Galahad to keep your own feelings in control. In fact, because I had nothing, could do nothing to help the cameramen, did help the people. And pushed in quite a few morphine needles myself into people. But, you know, we were involved, and how could we not be involved? Because, you know, people came from Peckham, and they came from Scotland, and they came from Wales and Northern Ireland, and these are my places.
The men in the ships of this task force are more at home then, because the Argentinians are simply strangers to the islands they call their own.
We've been told to expect an opposed landing. A company of about 100 Argentine soldiers had been seen in this area and were thought to be waiting for us. But in fact, when we waded ashore, there was neither sight nor sound of an enemy.
I saw another helicopter almost touch the water. Its rotor blades seemed to be spinning through the flames to pick up a man in a bright orange survival suit who was clinging to the anchor chain. It was a day of tragedy, but I vouch it was a day of extraordinary heroism and selfishness by every man who witnessed it.
Unfortunately, people have been seen on this skyline by the Argentine artillery spotters in Stanley. That's the reason they're shelling here, thinking that we are the main force. And behind us, shelling over our heads, are the British 105s. And all the time, helicopters coming in, dropping in troops. Here comes That's another one of their guns.
It's now 7 o'clock and the British troops have been here, some of them at least, for over 2.5 hours. They're all at this end of the town, near the racecourse. The Argentines, we haven't seen them yet, are at the other end of the town. And somewhere in the middle, General Moore is talking to General Menendez, and the outcome is being awaited here at this moment.
It's 11 weeks now since we left Portsmouth, with the bands playing and that forest of Union Jacks along the shoreline. It feels like a year, and that's as long as some people expected this war to last. As long as it would take to get the Argentines out.
The sights and sounds of 3 months of war reporting in the Falklands. And tonight we talk to two of the men you saw there, Michael Nicholson and Jeremy Hands. For Michael Nicholson, it was his 14th war. He left Portsmouth with a task force on the 4th of April, travelled down with them to the Falklands, reporting the British successes in the conflict in the air, and then British losses like HMS Sheffield. When British troops went ashore, Michael helicoptered to and from the islands, seeing for himself events like the bomb attacks in San Carlos water and on the Sir Galahad, and getting back to the ships to send back his reports. It was for Jeremy Hands his first war. He travelled down on the troop ship Canberra, was with the first troops who went ashore at San Carlos, and basically stayed with them through to the liberation of Port Stanley, with cameraman Bob Hammond and sound recordist John Martin. Well, Michael, experienced war veteran that you are, I mean, what was it like to leave Portsmouth?
Well, I knew you'd ask that question, because that's the first question that everybody asked. So I brought for you my diary. And the very first page of April the 5th, believe me, and this is how I wrote it. Boarded HMS Hermes 1000 hours, sailed at 10:45, for the Falklands via Ascension Island. Somebody says he feels a cheat with everybody waving the flags and saying goodbye and crying on the quay. Because we're not going to war, are we? We'll be home by the end of April.
You didn't believe that, sure.
And I knew what he meant, because really none of us did think we were going to war. And we didn't think we were going to war until we got down to the Ascension Islands. Remember, all the way down there we were practicing. The Sea Harrier pilots were practicing. The men at the guns were practicing. We had mock red air alerts, all practices. On Easter Sunday, and when we crossed the equator, the flight decks was cleared, and we had hockey matches and football matches, and we had hamburgers, and people were, met King Neptune. It was all great fun, but it was all practice.
And when did it finally come to an end?
It hit me, as it hit most people, I think here as well, when we heard that Sheffield had gone, when we saw that smoke on the horizon, and we heard that one of our favourite ships had been hit. And it ended for me, that practice feeling, that make-believe feeling, that we weren't actually going to go to a war, that the war had started, when I saw the survivors coming aboard. The Sheffield thing wasn't just the end of the practice war for us and the beginning of the real one, but it was also, for me anyway, the end of this myth of invincibility. Now, I don't want to sound as if I'm knocking the Navy, because I've got a great deal of respect for the Royal Navy. But, we'd believed everything that had been told us on the way down, that we had Sea Harriers to protect us in the air. We had submarines to protect us underneath. We had all these incredible missiles, the Sea Cat, Sea Slug, Sea Dart, Sea Wolf. Sea Wolf, they said, could knock a shell out of the sky. Had done so in practice. We had radar that could see the Falklands and see the mainland of the Argentine. There was no way that we were going to be hit by the Argentines. And then that afternoon, some daring young man in an Argentine étendard came within 6 miles of the Sheffield and released his exocet and knocked her out. And the end of that myth of invincibility began then for me. And suddenly I felt, and we all felt, terribly vulnerable. And all of a sudden, new things started to happen to us. All the hatches were closed down. All kind of new regulations were imposed. And I was astonished, because I thought the Royal Navy is one of the oldest navies in the world, and they survived the Second World War. And suddenly we're doing new things because we've been hit by this new missile. And I was not only astonished, I was a little frightened, because I realized that we were into something quite new. I mean, I remember one evening in the wardroom, we were having dinner, and all of a sudden, klaxon goes, red air alert, action stations. Pandemonium, everyone's running to their separate action stations, the men going to the guns, men going to the ops room, men going in all directions. But because of these new regulations after Sheffield, all the hatches were closed down. And I waited for 15 minutes in a queue of men with our survival suits, with our life jackets, with our masks on, our gloves on, trying to get up the stairs as men were trying to get down through this little hatch half the size of that table. And I thought, if anything happens now, we've had it. And I suddenly realized what it must be like to be in a ship that's hit with no way out.
What must it be like for the Harrier pilots, who were in the front line of defence as far as you were concerned, waiting to take off and perhaps facing such atrocious weather that they may not get back again?
The Harrier pilots, I've spoken at length to other people about the pilots, how different they are. What made me realise something about this was that people don't change, that the kind of breeds of man and the type of man who goes into this job is the same kind of man who went into the job 40 years ago. I mean, the Harrier pilots are still the fighter pilots, and they look the fighter pilots, they act the fighter pilots. The helicopter pilots are a different kind altogether.
How do they act the fighter pilots, though? tell me how a Harrier pilot acts.
They're I wouldn't say they're gung-ho, but they're very flamboyant, they're very flippant, they're always laughing and joking. I mean, I was there in the mist the night we lost our first pilot. He didn't come back. And he was a very popular man. Everyone liked him very much. And it was as if he'd never existed. It switched off. And I used to say to them, well, you guys are on your own. You leave this ship and off you go, 100 miles out to intercept. It must be very, very lonely and very frightening. What was it like, I said to one of them, who'd been the first man into Stanley and bombed Stanley airstrip. I said, what was it like? I mean, it must have been terrifying going into that barrage of Akak. He said, I can't remember. There's so much to do. The time I'd gone and done it and got out, it was all over. I tell you one thing about the pilots, the Sea Harriers. When it was foggy there, we had film. I remember seeing the film of it, of the Harriers on the deck, waiting to go, 2 of them on standby, a 5-minute standby. They're all in their cockpit, strapped in, canopies closed, full of fuel, bombs loaded, sidewinders on the end of their wings, ready to go off. And there's fog. And I said, it's difficult to get back. It must be dreadful. He said, no, it's not difficult. The odds are we wouldn't get back. And they meant it. These guys took off, going the distance they had to go to intercept. Coming back, all their radar tells them on their little screen in their cockpit is that there you are, there's your task force, now find your ship. And if they haven't got enough fuel to find Hermes or Invincible, they went into the sea. And they were faced with that every time they took off. That's what I mean by the men who laughed in the wardroom at night, but were faced with that kind of problem every day they took off.
Let's turn now to Jeremy, because Jeremy was following on behind in the troop ship Canberra. When war came, was it exactly as you imagined it to be, Jeremy?
Well, it was never like anything anybody had imagined all the way down. Again, as Mike has said, the practicing was going on for 6 weeks. There was the waiting, there was the build-up. And when we landed, of course, nobody had ever seen it before.
And you were in the first landing ship, weren't you?
Yes, we came ashore on that D-Day morning at about 4 o'clock in the morning. We crossed over to HMS Fearless, and with the Marines of 40 Commando, the camera crew and myself went in through the San Carlos water in probably the most unforgettable experience of the war, which was the fear of getting into a small landing craft, knowing that, or being told that at the other end there were Argentine troops who were waiting to kill us, and we were expecting them. Going through that night, and it was something, and nobody could forget. The soldiers were frightened, we were frightened. And hearing all around us the sights and sounds of a very heavy naval bombardment, and it was a staggeringly effective one. The night was lit up by the flashes of these guns from the big ships. There's no moon, there were stars, there were these crashes around the hills, these black hills all around us. The first time we'd seen the Falklands was the night. We'd heard all about them for so long, and then suddenly we were there. And we could just see these black silhouettes of hills, and this amazing display of shooting stars as we chugged through the water, almost silently. The odd funny remark, a few blokes trying to cheer each other up and keep warm, because that was the first taste of the real cold that we'd had. And then coming ashore when that ramp went down, and having to wade through this freezing water, which was almost a relief because we were so jittery at this stage. The soldiers, by this time, had clicked on to their professionalism. They knew where they were, they knew what was happening, and they charged out and they spread out and did their job, and our job was just to stay with them. It's too dark to film, but we were there to record as best we could what was happening. I had a tape recorder. We hit this beach, spread out, and then went up a bank, wondering where these Argentine soldiers were. And there were no mortars to meet us, there was no small arms fire, and we realised what happened. We didn't realise until later, but they'd heard us coming, which they weren't supposed to do, but thank God they did. They'd heard us coming and disappeared back into the hill.
When did the first firing take place, though? It was nicknamed Bomb Alley, wasn't it?
That was the ships in San Carlos water. The San Carlos water formed a valley, which the ships were in, and these Skyhawks and Mirages came in and attacked the shipping there, and did in fact hit us after they devastated the shipping for over a week. They suddenly found out where our positions were. And that was the worst moment of the war, I think, for us, because we had no alert, we had no warning, and suddenly planes, I saw these 3 planes coming at us, very low, very fast, and for that split second you're mesmerised. Everybody else scatters, and I could see these 3 shapes coming out of the sky, the cannons firing through the water and then onto the land. And that was the moment, the worst moment for me, because I thought I was going to die. Everybody in the task force at one time or other thought they were going to die. For me, it was that precise moment when I knew that these planes were going to drop bombs. And I hit the floor alongside a sheep shed, which was no cover, but I just dived into it, hands over my head like this. And I remember screwing my fingers like this, thinking, well, there's nothing you can do about it. Just wait. And then these 4 explosions, one of which killed a Marine I'd become quite friendly with, which was 50 yards away because I paced it out afterwards. Another one landed to my right, which killed an engineer, who I didn't know. The 2 others landed harmlessly and didn't kill anybody, but caused certain injuries. And it wasn't until afterwards, and on this one that had killed the Marine, I'd been thrown against this shed, and John Martin, who had a camera with him at that time, had the same experience. We were covered in stones and mud, and we thought for that moment, that's it, we really are dead now. Then we got up, walked up the hill to where they were digging this poor bloke out who'd been killed, and we saw a bomb that hadn't gone off, that was even closer to us than the one that had killed the Marine. If that one had gone, And of course we were never allowed to report the business about unexploded bombs, because if we had, the Argentines would have rearmed their bombs. But if that bomb had gone off, then we would never have come back, because it would certainly have killed us.
Why didn't you have some kind of frontline defence against that? It seemed there was a lot of criticism, wasn't there, at the time, that the Navy weren't supporting the troops on the ground?
No, that's not true. You know, let's knock that one on the head straight away. I heard some of my own colleagues criticising Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. I mean, he got the nickname of Windy Woodward. A lot of this came from anger, very understandable anger. When, you know, like Jeremy describes, when you're sitting on ships and sitting in your trench, and hour after hour, day after day, and it was a week of bombing, these Skyhawks and Mirages are coming in, and they're zapping you, and they're taking ships out, killing people. You seem to look up at the sky and say, now, where are those Harriers? Where is this combat air patrol that we've been told about? Where are all the boasts? Why haven't we got our cover? And where are these Rapiers that are supposed to be firing at these aircraft? Our marvellous ground defence systems, why aren't they firing? Of course, what we didn't know is that the carriers were out at sea sending off their Sea Harriers to try and meet these aircraft before they got to us. And we heard later, and you heard later, that out of every 10 aircraft that left the mainland, 6 went down. So only those 4 managed to get through to us, and often they didn't manage to get through. We just saw the residue. We didn't see the main force. And I don't think that Woodward had any choice but to stay where he was. He always told us from the very start, when we first met him off Ascension Island, he said, if I lose Hermes, we have to turn around. There will be no war. Once he lost the carriers, he lost his Sea Harrier, and he lost our air cover. So people who criticize him forget the fact that those Harriers, without them, we would never have landed. And he protected them and kept them intact as a fighting force in order that we could land as a fighting force. Something to be remembered.
Did the captains on these frigates know what was in Admiral Woodward's mind? Did they know that they were the main targets? That they would go down first rather than the aircraft carrier?
Again, I don't think I'm breaking his confidences. These things were told to me when the war was on. A lot of things were told to us when the war was on. The purpose of this program is to talk about the things we could not talk about when the war was on. And one of the things he told us is that he expected to lose 4 ships. You know, military men work out, like computer men, they work out all kind of rates and ratios. And the military ratio was that we would lose 4 ships. And of course we lost more. And had all the bombs gone off, we'd have lost a great many more. What happened was that the Argentines, in their haste, suddenly being confronted with all the ships that they saw in San Carlos water, and the bombardment from the machine guns and Bofors guns and the occasional missile to begin with, let off as quickly as they could and got away. And the bombs have to spend so much time in the air before they're ready to detonate. If I can describe, there's a little kind of propeller inside the end of a bomb. As it moves through the air, this propeller spins and winds in the detonator. And it's primed after about 8 seconds. And then whatever it hits, it explodes. But these bombs were landing too soon, and so they weren't properly primed. The tragedy of Sir Galahad was that that was the first ship they hit with the new technique, which was our technique of bringing an aircraft in like this with a bomb like this, coming in, and as it saw the ship lifting and throwing the bomb up, so it followed the aircraft went away, the bomb went up, and then came down and hit. And in that time, it was enough to prime it. And they learnt that technique and became suddenly very effective. We thank whoever was looking after us out there that the Argentines did not discover that technique until it was too late.
When we were on the land, with the troops, with the Marines, with the paras on the troops, the greatest danger was not from the aircraft at times, but from the British missiles that were fizzling out or going off target or losing their lock off the radar and ploughing into the hillsides. And you could see Marines and paras diving for their trenches after the planes had gone, because there'd be sea cats or sea darts or any of these other amazingly...
Well, what were the helicopter pilots doing up in the air then as exocet decoys? Weren't they the ones too that released the chaff you were talking about?
No, some of them did. Some of the helicopter, Sea King helicopters in the task force were used for that, and I think that's how this, Prince Andrew was a exocet decoy.
Just describe this word chaff, because I'm sure many people out there don't
Well,
understand
I'm sure you know it. I'm sure your father will remember what chaff is. I'm sure most fathers watching will remember chaff. In the last war, it was something that we used against the Nazi bombers coming over. I mean, it's just aluminium foil, And because the Exocet and many other missiles home in on either on metal or on objects or on radar, these things are sent up to confuse the missiles. It's just an enormous shower of aluminium foil which slowly sinks down.
They used to call it window, didn't they, in the last war?
They called it window.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when these Exocets were fired, up would go these enormous, they looked like shells, they would explode in the sky and they would shower the area to deflect, divert. But of course the tragedy was that although the carriers would send off the chaff to divert the missiles from them, the missiles had to go somewhere. So once the chaff dispersed, sank, the missile would then come back onto the next target. And the next target, because it was going away from Hermes or from Invincible, would tend to be one of our picket ships, like Sheffield, like Broadsword. And as it happened on one occasion, the nearest ship happened to be the Atlantic Conveyor.
It seems the most remarkable set of circumstances that we depend upon a Second World War technique and we sacrifice lives.
Look, I
highly,
tell you, the other Second World War
modern fleet,
techniques
you know.
they used was a thing called the Bofors guns. Now, the Bofors guns was something that, again, our fathers will remember very well, and any man in the Royal Navy in the Second World War will be very familiar with the Helican and the Bofors guns. The ones on Fearless were built during the Second World War. And GPMGs, the General Purpose Machine Gun, which is the kind of thing that we saw men carrying ashore with them, were actually mounted on HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible and all the warships of the fleet. Machine guns as additional firepower.
Because they were shooting down étendards and mirages with machine guns.
Not quite étendards, but certainly.
Well, they were bringing down some of these jets with machine guns, with the older, more basic type of equipment, because they could send up a wall of lead, tracer bullets, to make a pilot think twice before going in.
It was one of the tragedies, I think, in my mind, because I witnessed it, that one of the great tragedies of the war for me, and it follows on from this defence system, was Sir Galahad. By the time they arrived, the rapier systems should have been settled. They should have been on the hills overlooking Bluff Cove and that little estuary, to give these ships the defence in case there was air attack. But you know, I witnessed the attack. The rapiers were not fired. The blowpipes were not successful. Those poor ships were defenceless.
Some reports over here suggested that it was perhaps your reporting earlier in the week that pinpointed the British troops landing at Bluff Cove, and that's why the Argentine jets came in.
Yeah,
what would you say
well,
to that?
Let me answer that, not in self-defence, because I don't think self-defence is necessary, but let me tell you why these kind of stories became very common currency against us. One, the landing of the Welsh troops at Bluff Cove off Sir Galahad was a cock-up. And sooner or later, there will be a post-mortem on why those ships were there and why those men died. I'm not going to get involved in it now. But if I tell you that the man who was showing the troops around, giving them the routes and Argentinian positions, was a Falkland Islander who was risking his life to provide intelligence to the British troops about where the Argentines were, what routes they were using for their patrols. He warned the British military that the Argentines had OPs, observation posts, on the mountains overlooking Bluff Cove. The Two Sisters and Harrier, and could have seen everything. Even if they weren't there, the Argentines further towards Stanley, Mount William, and Tumbledown would have seen the air activity, the helicopter activity over Fitzroy Bluff Cove. They must have known we were there. It would not have taken much to know that ships were coming in.
It brings us into this area, of course, of the Ministry of Defence and your relationship with the men from the Ministry on board these ships. I mean, generally, did you feel as though the war was conducted properly?
Yes, I mean, they had a job to do. Their job was to make sure, as men from the Ministry, that the national security and the operation was not in any way jeopardised by what we were reporting back. Now, we accepted that. It was in our own interests to go along with that, because if anybody got killed, it was likely to be us along with anybody else. Fair enough. What we objected to, and very strongly, was their own incredibly inept interpretation of their own signals from London, their own guidelines from their bosses in London to us, who were having a pretty hard job on shore anyway, in what we could and what we couldn't say. Their straightforward bloody-mindedness, as it turned out in the end, restricted the very best aspects and the most useful aspects of the whole operation for the British public.
Let's pause for a moment. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. You became very patriotic, and in fact the two of you became very patriotic during this war, and you referred to the troops as our troops.
Ah!
Now why?
we?
Were you not a war correspondent, a little step back, a little step aside from what was actually going on? You weren't actually one of the troops,
you
were
make
you?
patriotic sound like a sin.
Well, you tell me.
No, I mean, you know, this business of non-bias and impartiality.
Exactly.
And for a long time, I think we both kept to the British troops, and the British local commanders say, and British Sea Harriers today did this, and you know, we kept to the British bit and the Argentine bit, not us and the enemy. I never introduced enemy into my commentaries or reports, nor would I ever. But I must admit that bit by bit ours started to creep in. I think it's the fact that it was our war, and I am British, and I was with British troops, and it was difficult, without sounding too profound about it, but it was difficult sometimes to keep your own feelings in control. It was very difficult at the time of Sir Galahad to keep your own feelings in control. You know, one wanted to help. In fact, I did, because there's nothing I could do with the camera. The cameraman stood there like, you know, like the rock and didn't move and did his filming. There was abuse. People who came off the ships were shocked and disgusted, and some soldiers were disgusted to find us filming at times like that. And there was abuse shouted at us. In fact, because I had nothing, could do nothing to help the cameraman, did help the people, and pushed in quite a few morphine needles myself into people. But you know, we were involved, and how could we not be involved? Because you know, people came from Peckham, and they came from Scotland, and they came from Wales and Northern Ireland, and these are places. These are my places. The guys I found them incredible. You know, the war's over. My impartial reporting can end, and I can be suddenly very partial and say that I found them all fantastic fellas, and I was proud to be with them. Never, never, never in 3 months, and cross my heart and hope to die, did I ever hear any one of them moan. And I mean that. I never heard a moan. You know, we saw them all. We weren't with the...
Not moan about the food, the conditions of living there.
Of course they moan about
that.
the food. We all moan about the food, and the cups of tea are always too cold and too much sugar in them, or not enough sugar in them. But, you know, they never moaned about the real things. And we weren't with the officers and gentlemen for 24 hours a day. We went with all the lads, and we went right down in the ships, right down to the lowest decks, right down with the stokers, and we were living with the guys in their trenches, and we were living with them in their virtually their mud huts. And I never heard a moan. And I don't want to elevate Mr. Ordinary Man into something that he ought not to be, but when we kept probing them, do you still think it's worthwhile? You know, you've lost your friend, or you know, tomorrow you're going to go over the top again, and you know what it's like. And is it worthwhile for this bit of bog? Mm-hmm. And they say, well, yeah, of course it is. It's not this, is it? It's this principle. You know, the RG shouldn't be here, should they? I mean, it's our country, and it's a bit of England, and if they don't like it, well, you know, they'll have to get off, and we'll go through and we'll do what we have to do to get them off. And I was astonished at this.
And right the way through, even after the deaths and what they experienced, they still went on.
I was astonished by it.
It's professionalism. I mean, these guys, most of them were still in their teens. They were professionals. They didn't, I don't think, really think an awful lot about the rights and wrongs of what they were there for. They were trained soldiers, they were trained Marines, they were trained paratroopers, guardsmen, whatever. They knew their job, they knew how to go about it, they knew the conditions were going to be bad, and they did the job bloody brilliantly.
Let's look now at some men that I believe have gone down in heroic folklore. The SAS, the SBS, we've heard about their retaking of South Georgia. Yeah. We've heard an awful lot. But you actually lived with them, you went with them on forays, didn't you? Tell me about the SAS.
Well, our first experience of the SAS was aboard Hermes, and I don't know if you know, but British forces were on the Argentine mainland long before anyone ever thought, and I don't mean South Georgia, I mean the Argentine mainland. And they were in daily, hourly, sometimes minute communication with the SAS who were aboard Hermes. Now, we were told that British forces, special forces, they could be SBS or SAS, were at airstrips in the Argentine, and that our people aboard Hermes were getting 2-minute warnings every time military aircraft took off from those airstrips to come and hit us. I know that because there was a time when we were allowed to go freely on Hermes, anywhere we wanted to, more especially on the top deck, the goofing deck. It's called goofing, you know, is a kind of Navy expression for kind of looking, see what's going on. And that was our best position. We could see everything that was going on. But all of a sudden they said, you must not go to the goofing deck. And then we realized why, because we suddenly saw men, you know, up there in khaki. You know, the SAS are a very unruly lot. They never cut their hair and they never wear badges of rank, and of course all these guys fitted into that description, and they started to erect these strange areas which reinforced little rumours and reports that had come into us from people who wanted to tell us things aboard ship, that the SAS were in daily, hourly contact with their men on the mainlands. And this worked well. It means that, you know, we didn't have to wait for our radar to pick up planes. The guys on the mainland were telling us.
A helicopter crashed, killing SAS men on board. Why did that happen?
Our information was that an albatross, of all things, had been swept into the air intake of the helicopter. See, what happened was at night, gash was ditched, a very famous RN phrase. That means that you're throwing all your rubbish overboard. You couldn't do it during the daytime because aerial reconnaissance, Argentine reconnaissance, would pick up these trails of rubbish in the sea and know exactly which route we were taking and where we were. So you could only get rid of your rubbish during the night. And this, of course, attracted birds. They were always with us. Even hundreds of miles out to sea, there'd be a flock of birds, including these enormous albatross. And it seems that the aircraft took off. 2 of them took off. One got there, one didn't. And they went into the sea.
Because of the clandestine operations that these 2 particular groups were involved in, the SAS and the SBS worked independently of virtually everybody except themselves. They weren't even under the direct orders of certain of the military commanders. They were under the orders of their own people. Now, by virtue of the fact that they were infiltrating the towns and the settlements, living with the people, living out in the fields and out in the camp, as it was called, the open country, as shepherds or as hill farmers or whatever, an enormous risk to themselves. If anybody had compromised their identity, they'd have immediately been killed, there's no question at all. But on one occasion, there was an SAS patrol out in one of the areas near Mount Kent, and an SBS patrol working independently in the similar area. They both noticed each other in the dark, assumed the other to be opposition, usual challenges, no response, and there was a firefight in which one SBS man was killed.
Were you as disappointed as we were back home that the runway in Stanley hadn't actually been taken out?
Well, we heard after the first raid, because we were on Hermes at the time, that one bomber had gone across and dropped 21 bombs. And we got the Harrier photographs soon afterwards that showed that of the 21 bombs, 1 had hit the runway. Then we heard about a week later that another Vulcan had come in with another 21 bombs, 1,000 pounds each. And we saw the aerial photography after that, and all the bombs had missed. And then we heard there'd been a 3rd run, and we didn't know the result of that. But when we got into Stanley airstrip, we looked for the craters, and there was still only 1. Except we saw these enormous, kind of smaller craters with mud piled around, you know, mud about a foot deep. So we thought, well, they must be Harrier attacks. The Harriers must have come and finished the job. Until, of course, we realized that they weren't craters at all. They were dummy craters. The Argentines had very cleverly brought out mud and had piled this mud in an enormous circle, like, you know, a bit like this carpet, only about 30 feet across. So from the air, the runway looked as if it was cratered all over. But all the Argentine aircraft had to do, the C-130s, was to take off backwards and forwards across this mud during the night. And then at daybreak, they would come out and they would tidy it all up to make it look like craters again. So whenever our planes came over to take photographs, it looked well and truly cratered.
We'd been told all the way down that the airfield was out of order, the runway had been completely taken out, and yet right up until the night before Stanley was taken and we saw this, they were still bringing in their supply aircraft and landing at Stanley Airfield.
What about the weapons that British troops had? Was there anything particularly that frightened the Argentines more than any other?
The Milan was a classic example of this. It was a very powerful, high explosive, anti-tank, wire-guided missile which could home in on a target 4,000 metres away and obliterate it. So they used this to devastating effect on trenches. And once one of these things has hit a trench, there's absolutely nothing and nobody left.
Plenty of stories, of course, of prisoners, Argentine prisoners being taken and their fear of what the British troops would do to them.
They'd been told by their officers that if they were caught, they would be shot by the British. And there were even stories...
And eaten.
And eaten. They were told the Gurkhas would eat them. And they believed it.
Let's turn now to the Falkland Islanders. You went ashore, and you obviously probably were the first to meet these people.
They'd seen the soldiers. They were grateful, and they'd met us with a certain amount of enthusiasm. But then, very quickly, I noticed that the Falkland Islanders didn't want too many British soldiers there either. And the gratitude, although it was there, and is still there, and will probably be there forever, seemed to be very short-lived in practical terms.
It brings us again into the relationship between officers and their men. Was it a very disciplined thing, this command down the line, or was it fairly easygoing?
I found it very, very democratic. Again, let's not go over the top. The Navy is a fairly rigid service, and you know, there is very obvious demarcation. But I found with the Army that once the war had started and they came off their ships together, they stuck together, the officers dug their own trenches, slept in exactly the same conditions, nobody carried a camp bed for them, and a marvellous sense of camaraderie. But once the war had ended, and it was no more slouching, I mean, the old Sergeant Major was, right, in lines, when I say move, you move, and off they went like that, running back down the road, double time. You know, that was peacetime Army again.
I'll tell you a story about after the raid on Pebble Island by the SAS, when they took out so many of the Argentine Pucara aircraft. It was seen that the soldiers ran away. They didn't stay around to be shot at. The Argentine soldiers ran away, and the SAS did their job, and then they were brought back by an officer who was leading them on, saying, come, you know, lead them on. So the SAS thought, right, this is the right thing to do, shoot the officer. Shot the officer, he went down, the soldiers ran away again. And it got back to the Royal Marines and the paras on the ships, shoot the officers first. And one of the COs was telling this to his men. He said, shoot the officers first. If you see anybody leading anybody on, shoot him. And somebody at the back shouted out, can we have a practice first, sir?
What about Prince Andrew? What kind of a role did he play down there?
He was like any other of the pilots. He was given no extra privileges, nor did I think he expected them.
And I was in the middle of sending a report back here when there was Prince Andrew, large as life, in the radio room. I finished my report and he said, do you mind if I make a call home? The radio officer said, no, of course not. I said, I've got a credit card. And the radio officer said, I think you'll be able to reverse the charges.
And obviously, I've got to ask you, would you both do it all over again? Would you go back?
Well, he's done it 14 times.
To war?
And the
Well,
answer,
15th time, do you
the
think?
answer's still no. No, I made a promise to my kids that I would never do it again, and they say, but you're always saying that, Daddy, and I say, this time, mates, I really mean it.
Do you?
Yeah.
Jeremy?
No, I would do it again. People have said to you, so many people have said since coming home, did you have a good time? And the answer is no. It was a lousy time. It was 95% misery and cold and a lot of boredom and 5% sheer stark terror. But I wouldn't have missed it for the world, because it's an experience that can never be repeated. And if there is a chance to do anything like it ever again, then yes, I would do it again, although at the time I said no, I wouldn't.
Well, Jeremy and Michael, it's good to have you back home again, and safe and sound too. Michael Nicholson and Jeremy Hands.